have, over the course of this semester and last semester, put in a series of speakers who have been talking about various groups in society who, from the point of view of a large number of people, who are not necessarily correct, but looked at these people as being different. And because they looked at them as being different, they were treated differently. The speaker we have today is someone exceptional. I never met him until about 20 minutes ago, but when Susan said, you know, let me give you some notes about who he is, I said, I wish I was a student at his college, because so many of the courses that he teaches at, I said, I'd really like to take. So just let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Dr. Christian Paving is a professor at Dowling College. He has been there since 1998 and has been chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies for over 3 of his years at the school. And listen to this, he teaches a wide variety of courses covering philosophy, critical thinking, ethics, criminal justice, the culture of matters, sometimes I think we live in the culture of matters, ethics and values in science, moral theory, the philosophy of sex and love, law, education, psychiatry, and psychology. Wow. He is committed to making philosophy accessible to a wider group of people and spelling out how philosophical ideas are part of the fabric of everyday life. Dr. Paving runs the Metapsychology online review website and is on the editorial board of Philosophers Magazine. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. Thanks to Susan and the Holocaust Center for that. So my topic is the mentally ill people as unfit for society. Really, my area of discussion is going to be broader than just the mentally ill. I'm going to be talking generally about the history of eugenics. So I'll be focusing on the mentally ill, but what I'm going to be talking about will apply to quite a lot of other areas too, generally to issues in disability. So I'm going to be talking about, this is my outline, I'm going to be talking about the history of eugenics, and then kind of current and future problems in our society regarding mental illness and disability, and the relationship between how things are now and kind of the issues that were faced around the beginning of the 20th century up until the Second World War. I mean, to give, I don't like to just kind of leave my take-home message until the end. So my take-home message is going to be basically that the issues facing kind of describing people as unfit, or describing some lives as more worthy or less worthy than others, are issues that are kind of persisting today. So that while the history of eugenics and the history of the Holocaust was kind of truly horrible and something we want to avoid, it is not as if we can simply do away with making those sorts of value judgments. And there's something we have to do very carefully, and keeping in mind the history that we're faced with from the 20th century. So I want to give you some sort of background. Let me ask you this. How many of you are familiar with the term eugenics? So it's a new term for most of you. Eugenics is the science, the supposed science of improving a race or improving a people. And it was very much based on the theories of Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin gave a descriptive theory where he was describing how species and mankind evolved over the hundreds of thousands and even millions of years from the dawn of our planet. So that was a descriptive theory, and it didn't have in itself any particular implications for how we should live now. So a scientific theory is meant to be value neutral. But it had a profound influence on thinking in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And in particular, one of Darwin's followers, Francis Galton, took up his views and applied it to how society should be. Galton, he was mainly in the 19th century. He was born in 1822, and he was a scientist, a mathematician, a very kind of learned and scholarly person. But he's mainly remembered these days for his creation of the science of eugenics. He was English, as was Darwin, and so he created the term eugenics in 1883. Now, he was in favor of positive eugenics. So the basic idea of eugenics is that if you have in a society a variety of different kinds of people, some of them are going to be better for society than others. And the idea of eugenics is that you want to promote those people in society who are kind of valuable, and you want to have less of those who are not valuable. And so the idea was that this was a scientific theory, and that you could do away with old forms of prejudice, and you could base your value judgments on science. Now, there's a distinction between positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is basically trying to encourage those who are valuable for society to have as many offspring as possible, and to try and increase their portion of the population. While negative eugenics is trying to stop people who are considered bad for society from reproducing. And in fact, in extreme forms, you wouldn't just stop them from reproducing, you would kill them. Right? That's the most extreme form of negative eugenics. So Galton himself was not very much in favor of negative eugenics, but he was in favor of trying to encourage those in society who were most valuable to have as many offspring as possible. So this, Galton's ideas were very influential. And eugenics soon became an international movement. It was popular in, both in the United States and Canada, and all over Western and Northern Europe. And it was also spread to other parts of the world. You can find eugenics movements in Russia, in South America, and it was also used by a lot of colonial countries. The UK, England had colonies all over the world, and it exported its eugenic ideas to a lot of the rest of the world. The eugenics movement as a scientific idea was very, it fit very well with the other worries that people had around that time. And certainly in the USA and in some other countries too, there was extreme worries about immigration. If you know about the history of the USA, there were very severe holds and kind of demands put on immigrants, and there was a lot of worry about who was coming into the USA, and so that fit in with ideas about racial purity. Eugenics grew from its birth in the late 19th century and grew stronger and stronger up until World War II. And it's important to note that it was embraced not only by people who we would see on the right wing, but also it was embraced in countries we also see as socialist. So it was quite strong in Sweden, for instance. We think of Sweden as a socialist country, kind of very committed to equality in some ways, but it was the idea of having a unity and kind of the purity was very appealing to them. One of the I'm going to give you some of the main people who were involved in eugenics in the USA, and then I'll be moving to eugenics in Europe. So this is not going to be a complete history by any means, but it gives you at least some flavor of how important eugenics was in the USA about 100 years ago. So David Starr Jordan, he lived up until 1931. He was an influential man. He was president of Stanford University for over 20 years, and he was also chancellor there. I mentioned the idea that eugenics went across the political spectrum. David Starr Jackson was a pacifist. So he was by no means a warmonger, but he believed very strongly in the idea of eugenics. He was a president of the National Education Association. So one of his quotes was, "No community was ever built up of thieves and imbeciles." And he also he published a great many books. One of his most notable is "The Blood of the Nation: A Study in the Decay of Races by the Survival of the Unfit." Now, Jordan was very influential in creating one of the important parts of eugenics in the USA, which was the Committee on Eugenics, formed in 1909. It was created by the American Breeders Association. And you think, well, that's to do with farming, but this is very much to do with the human population. And this Committee on Eugenics had some of the kind of most important people in America on that committee. The secretary was Charles Benedict Davenport. He was from Harvard. And other members of the committee were Alexander Graham Bell. So that name should be familiar to you. Can anybody tell me who Alexander Graham Bell was? He invented the telephone. Like a very important man. Vernon Kellogg was associated with Kellogg's, a very successful food company. And other people on the committee was Adolf Meyer, who was one of the main psychiatrists in the USA. He was at Johns Hopkins. This Committee on Eugenics had some of the most kind of powerful and important people in America. They created the Eugenics Record Office, which is here on Long Island. It's at Cold Spring Harbor. And the creation of the Eugenics Record Office was funded by the Harriman family. I think they made their money from the railroad, and one of the richest families in New York. There was the Rockefeller family and the Carnegie Foundation. So these are some of the most powerful and well-known names in the USA, and they created the Eugenics Record Office. The basic premise of the Eugenics Record Office was this, from this quotation here: "Society must protect itself as it claims the right to deprive the murderer of his life, so also it may annihilate the hideous serpent of hopelessly vicious protoplasm." So the basic idea of eugenics is that there are some people in society who are not welcome, who we don't like, and we want to try and get rid of them. And this was, there's a close association between this and the Long Island Biological Society. These are some pictures of the Eugenics Record Office. One of the main names from the Eugenics Record Office was H.H. Laughlin, well-known person. He had a PhD in biology from Princeton. Under his leadership, the office made an estimate that about 10% of the USA population were unfit. Laughlin himself advocated for compulsory sterilization. Now, his ideas weren't weren't completely accepted, and prominent organizations disagreed with them. So there was the American Bar Association, for instance, was against it. Certainly there was a very active movement for sterilization in the United States. So in the late 19th century, there was sterilization was used as a cure. I think that some of their ideas seem very curious to us now. So some people thought that women's mental illness could be cured by removing the ovaries. It's hard to see how removing someone's ovaries would help their mental health, but that was I think it was associated with the idea of hysteria and a kind of a wandering uterus. And, it was some of their ideas, although it was the scientific age, they seem very bizarre to us. There was also a great deal of worry about masturbation in the late 19th century and early 20th century. They thought the idea was that masturbation led to insanity. And there was so it's also castration of men was used as a cure for insanity. One of the kind of central ideas and why it was related to eugenics was the belief that mental illness, and especially severe mental illness, was hereditary. One prominent psychiatrist argued that drunkenness, insanity, and criminal traits were passed from parent to child. So that was one of the reasons why it was thought that sexual criminals should be castrated. So it wasn't necessarily just as a punishment, but also the idea that sexual criminals should not have children because their offspring would be more likely to be sexual criminals themselves. So sterilization became a popular movement in the United States. So to give you one example of Kansas, way back in 1898, one psychiatrist, Dr. Hoyt Pitcher, who worked at the Institution for the Feeble-Minded Children, got permission to castrate 58 boys. And by the 1910s, sterilization had become common. It was strangely, it wasn't actually legalized until 1913. So they did a lot of castration and sterilization before it was even legal. There's an estimate that up to and this went on to the 1950s, it was estimated that Kansas sterilized about 2,800 patients, including nearly 800 who were classified as feeble-minded. So that's a dramatic number of people. In Indiana, Indiana was well known as leading the charge for having compulsory sterilization. It was advocated by Harry Clay Sharp, who argued that no confirmed criminal or other degenerate ever begot a normal child. Right? So there was they thought that if you're a criminal, then you were likely to have criminal children, or at least abnormal children. So in 1907, Indiana passed compulsory sterilization laws, and many other states followed. By the mid-1930s, 30 states in the United States had compulsory sterilization laws, including New York in 1912 and New Jersey in 1911. And by 1942, there had been roughly 38,000 sterilizations performed in the United States, which is a dramatic number. And certainly this was not uncontroversial. Many people had opposition to this, and it was fought in the courts. There was a test case with the state of Virginia. Some states disapproved of sterilization and they struck it down. Virginia approved it in 1925, and there was a test case of Carrie Buck. She was classified as being epileptic and feeble-minded. I think she'd had one child. And Virginia wanted to sterilize her. So it went to the Supreme Court. Laughlin, who you saw before as leader of the Eugenics office, said these people belong to the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South. And the United States Supreme Court approved of sterilization in 1927. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote the decision. And he compared the sacrifice of women's fertility to the sacrifice of men who gave their lives in the Second World War. And he thought this is certainly justified. He said it's better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles, the claim was that Carrie Buck was the 3rd generation of imbeciles. She said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So that's the history of eugenics in the United States. And eugenics certainly the United States was in some ways the country which led the compulsory sterilization. And the United States was actually very influential on policy in Germany. But certainly once the Nazis took power in Germany, kind of things kind of accelerated rapidly. And eugenics was spread with anti-Semitism and combined with anti-Semitism to ultimately lead to the Holocaust. But it's important to note then that Germany was not alone in its views there. And eugenics was a popular movement both in the United States and across Europe. So some of the history of kind of what led to the final solution will be somewhat familiar to you. I want to give you at least just some of the history here for completeness. So some of the markers were the creation of the Nuremberg laws in 1935. Notice 1935 is a long time after a lot of these changes were happening in the United States. The United States Supreme Court case was 1927, so this is 8 years after that. And they passed the law for the protection of German blood and honor and the citizenship law, both which were limits on marriage. And there was a marital health law, the law for the protection of the genetic health of the German people, which required a marriage certificate for people so they could prevent racial damage. And so they were looking for a history of feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, venereal disease, or other what they called racially contagious diseases. And it was around this time that the German people started to also focus on the Romas, who they would sometimes call the gypsies. So there was this focus on the idea of Aryan blood. Sterilization in Germany started around 1933, and there was forced sterilization of disabled people, blacks or Afro-Germans, and the Roma. And it was done under the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring, under the idea that you wanted to keep the race good and pure, and so they wanted to avoid diseases like schizophrenia, manic depression, epilepsy, and then, but also blindness, deafness when these were hereditary, and even extreme alcoholism. They also believed that criminality, as in the USA, they believed that criminality was hereditary. And so there was the move to sterilize habitual criminals. So there was a law on measures of security and reform which wanted to place people who were called asocial, we might call them antisocial now, in mental hospitals. And as in the USA, there was a move to castrate sexual deviants. So these policies were put in place in Germany from 1933 up to 1945. And the estimates are that something like 400,000 Germans were sterilized. And the peak of that was from 1934 to 1937. The bulk of people who were sterilized were people who were classified as having low IQ, or what was known as being feeble-minded. But the other groups of people who were sterilized were people with schizophrenia, epilepsy, or severe alcoholism. There was an appeals process, but the appeals process was very unlikely to be successful. So if you were it was decided you were going to be sterilized, you could appeal, but you didn't have much chance of success. Now, in Germany, the move went from there being sterilization, moving to euthanasia, and I think whenever we talk about euthanasia in Germany around this time, we think about it in scare quotes. I mean, generally the idea of euthanasia is mercy killing. And in some ways, I think many of us will approve of some kinds of mercy killing. And certainly any of us who've had pets, who've been suffering, we believe in mercy killing of pets. And there are controversial cases in medical ethics these days with people whose lives look very grim, and they want to die. And there's an active debate about whether euthanasia is permissible in those sorts of cases. But the kind of euthanasia that was being considered in Germany was maybe better called murder. But the idea was that it was killing, the justification was that it was killing people for their own good. And the idea for euthanasia was, at least one of the main architects of it was Dr. Alfred Plutz, who was a major scientist in Germany and an international scientist. He met at various international meetings with the leading US scientists. He argued that you needed euthanasia to strengthen the degenerative racial stock. You needed to get the bad stock out of the German race. He formed the Journal for Racial and Social Biology, and he created the Society for Racial Hygiene. And so there was, back then, back in 1904, there wasn't active murder, but there was a willingness to let people who were considered unfit die. So during the World War I, which is a very there was great poverty in Germany around that time. One of their decisions in Germany was to let the inmates of their mental institutions die of malnutrition. So there was thought that it was better to send the food to the soldiers rather than give it to the mental patients. So you might see that as a kind of euthanasia. And there was the basic idea coming from around 1920 was some people had unnecessary lives. The leading members of the legal profession and the psychiatric profession, Karl Binding and Alfred Hoch, advocated for euthanasia. And they argued that some people were incurable idiots and brain-damaged human vegetables. And so they thought that they'd be better off dead. And combined with this was, both in the USA and in the rest of Europe, there was a massive growth in the population of mental institutions. So there was a sense of crisis that they needed to do something to reduce the numbers. In 1932, Berthold Kuhn argued that there was you needed to have a eugenic solution to these sorts of problems. And here you have pictured Gerhard Wagner, who was head of the German Physicians League. And he said that a society that put the sick, the dying, and the unfit on a par with the healthy and the strong was dangerous. So there was this move to euthanasia. I think what's going to really, I think the point I want to drive home that it wasn't just people who were at the kind of political extremes. These were the scientific leaders of Germany, and a lot of people in the rest of the international community were very much on board with these ideas. The first active major move in euthanasia was the euthanizing children. So it started off with children who were 3 years and younger. and who had Down syndrome or were diagnosed as being idiots, as a technical term, so-called, or who were diagnosed with microcephaly, hydrocephalus, and who had deformities, the missing arms or legs, or who were paralyzed. So the move to kind of achieve racial purity started with those children, and it was rapidly expanded. So it started off with children who were 3 years younger. By 1941, it included all children with any disability. They were candidates for euthanasia, and this program led to probably around more than 5,000 children being killed. And this is expanded to adult euthanasia. Hitler approved for doctors to conduct euthanasia on people with incurable sickness in a letter in 1939. And there was a general requirement for all doctors to report adults who had serious mental problems, who had epilepsy or had a low IQ. Also people with incurable physical illnesses. This was known as the T4 program, and it led to the murder, or euthanasia so-called, of at least 70,000 disabled adults between 1939 and 1941. And developing this technology for killing was one of the things that was then used. That technology was then used in concentration camps for the mass murder of Jews. So I think it's not often understood that the final solution was very much led with the idea of killing people or getting rid of people who were considered unfit in terms of their mental health and their disabilities, and that was like the scientific rationale for the final solution, and it was popular with a lot of different scientists. Okay. All right. So now I want to move to kind of the current situation, as I promised to do. Because as I said at the start, one of my main arguments is that the reaction, we might want to say, well, now we've passed the Second World War, and we no longer make those sorts of judgments. We don't judge people to be unfit. And what I want to say is, we are still trying to make those judgments and working out how to decide who should live and who should die. Now, psychiatry has existed in some ways since ancient times, and has been considered a science since about 1879. Psychiatry has always been a kind of a contested area with many different sorts of theories, many different approaches, and the problems of psychiatry in the 20th century have been the increasing number of people diagnosed with severe mental illnesses and working out how to deal with them. And the major mental illnesses that psychiatry deals with are conditions not necessarily given those names then, but now we call schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. Now, one of the major theorists of psychiatry was German. He was born in 1856, Emil Kraepelin, and died in 1926. Kraepelin was still considered a very important psychiatric theorist, and as a theorist, he's not simplistic. He has quite a sophisticated view, but certainly what he's best known for is his emphasis on the idea that mental illness is an organic brain disease, and that it needs to be seen as such and treated as such. And certainly that idea has been a major part of contemporary thought. These days, mental illnesses are often described, many mental illnesses are described as brain diseases or brain disorders. Certainly, Kreplin's influence was very important in starting that line of thought. As I've said, the care of the mentally ill in the USA has been a major issue. Asylums grew, and the number of asylums and the number of people in asylums grew rapidly. For example, in 1865, the New York legislature authorized a building in Willard, near Utica, 1,500-bed hospital. In 1890, the State Care Act led to a state responsibility for the mentally ill. So that was one of the reasons why the worries about mental illness transferred from families to the state. One of the best known and one of the biggest state mental hospitals, is on Long Island. You may have driven past it at some point if you've ever been out in Long Island, is a Pilgrim State Hospital. It started in 1929. It had 100 patients. Within a year, it had over 2,000 patients. By 1954, its population grew to 13,000 patients. So it was by no means the only mental hospital on Long Island. There were several other. Kings Park is another well-known mental hospital. So the population of people diagnosed with severe mental illnesses was growing rapidly up to the 1950s. Certainly psychiatry has, I haven't got time to rehearse all the kind of issues to do with psychiatry now, but there's been a long history of mistreatment of patients in asylums. There's been lots of worries about the cost of patients, and there have been various scandals to do with how mentally ill people have been treated. One of the other issues is how do you actually get good doctors to practice psychiatry? Psychiatry has long been one of the low prestige routes for doctors to go in. It's generally going to be much more profitable, much more, people are going to get paid better, and they're going to have more prestige if they go into other areas of medicine as opposed to psychiatry. All right. So how have things changed in the modern world from the time of eugenics? Well, we don't use the word eugenics anymore. Certainly, it's very kind of nobody is going to call themselves a eugenicist. We don't use the phrase "the unfit," in fact, psychiatry. If you look at the diagnostic manual in psychiatry called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there is no category for insanity. People don't use madness or insanity or words like that. And we also don't use words like idiot or feeble-minded. So there's been a change in language. It's slightly ironic. One of the changes in language that was proposed through the 20th century to cover people who were regarded as idiots or feeble-minded was moron. Now, moron was not very successful as a new term. It soon became associated, it had the same negative connotation as idiot or retarded. In more recently, there's the idea of people who are special or special education. My sense is that some of the problems that occurred with the term moron are now occurring with the term special. That to call somebody special is not necessarily to give them a compliment now, if you in a context of saying they have cognitive deficits. It tends to be that our language to describe people who are regarded as having a low IQ or having cognitive deficits is constantly changing, so we can try and avoid the stigma that's associated with that. Certainly euthanasia and letting people die has become a major issue in medical ethics, as I was discussing before. So one of the big debates in modern medicine is the use of physician-assisted suicide. Physician-assisted suicide is not legal in New York, and it's not legal in most states in the United States, but it is legal in Oregon and Washington State. There are fairly strict controls about who can request suicide. Certainly in the United States, you have to be diagnosed with a terminal illness to be able to request suicide, and it has to be your choice. It's not a matter of somebody else deciding that you should not live. It's your choice. But still, the ultimate decision that somebody is making is that their life is no longer worth living. And so so it goes back to the issues that were kind of discussed around the beginning of the century, like which lives are not worth living. There's also been cases of when we can withdraw life-saving treatment from people. One very famous case, what was it, from the 1990s, was Terry Schiavo, who's pictured at the top there. And there was a disagreement between family members about whether she should continue to receive treatment or not. There was some evidence that she would have preferred not to have treatment, but that was disputed. She was from a fairly strong Roman Catholic family, and her family said that she would have wanted treatment. Very recently, there's the case of Jahi McMath. You may have seen it in the news. She's a 13-year-old girl who doctors say is brain dead, and her mother says she's simply sleeping. And so her mother wants to have the treatment continued. The doctors in the hospital said they did not want to continue treating her because they felt like it was a waste of resources. Jahi's still being treated, but at least according to some medical ethicists, she's no longer, although her heart is beating through the use of machines, and she's receiving sustenance through tubes, she could be declared dead if that was if her parents would allow it. So there are some very controversial cases going on right now about who should be allowed to live and who should be allowed to die. Certainly, there's the issues of genetics are very powerful and very important, and modern technology is growing all the time. One of the main treatments that's used these days is in vitro fertilization, it's quite a common thing these days for couples who have a difficult time getting pregnant to use in vitro fertilization. One of the things that in vitro fertilization allows is the genetic testing of fertilized eggs before implantation in the woman. The eggs are fertilized in the lab, and then they're tested, and then it's decided which ones to implant into the woman. That means that parents or other people can decide which sorts of traits should continue to exist and which should not. Generally, the idea, this is based on the idea that we don't want to continue what we see as serious genetic diseases, conditions such as Down syndrome. But it seems like the future holds the possibility that we will have predictions for other traits such as height, and at least some people believe that we will be able to predict sexual preference. And so it'll be the option for parents to decide whether they want to have a straight child or a gay child. And so there'll be a question like, what would that mean for the random diversity of people that we have now if parents start being able to control what kind of children they have? Another technology which is growing greatly is germline gene therapy. And germline gene therapy means that any changes you make to genes of one person would also get passed to their children. Although we don't use the word eugenics these days, in some ways similar decisions are being made. We're still looking at questions about which lives do we want to continue, what kinds of conditions do we want to continue, which ones do we say should not exist. Most prospective parents would say they don't want to have a child with Down syndrome, with spina bifida, or with fetal lung maturity. Of parents or women who have an amniocentesis and they find that their fetus is carrying Down syndrome, 90% of those decide to have an abortion. Suddenly people are making decisions about what lives they consider to be valuable and what lives they don't want to continue into the world. It means that we are still making decisions about which lives are good and which lives are not good. Now there has been a considerable disagreement about this, there's a portion of the disability rights movement have strongly argued that these sorts of decisions are deeply troubling. The particular group of people who have been arguing this are the people who say that that society, disability is not something that's intrinsic, but rather that it's imposed on the way society treats people. It's been particularly powerful with advocates of deafness and some advocates for people on the autistic spectrum, especially people who are known as having Asperger's. They've argued that those are not diseases or disabilities intrinsically, rather they're simply differences between people, and that we shouldn't make judgments about what kinds of people, whether those kinds of people should live or die. We should be much more inclusive as a society. So the disability rights movement is not completely theoretically unified, but it certainly has argued to some extent that we should be much more welcoming of people with disabilities, and we shouldn't decide that those lives are not worth living. Okay. Now, I think this social model of disability is certainly a very important idea, and certainly gives a lot of insight into the way that society does make the lives of people with disabilities more difficult. But I think we don't necessarily have to accept the whole social model in order to take some insights from it. It is certainly true that people with mental illnesses and other disorders can have very good lives, and so to simply decide that people with Down syndrome shouldn't exist or their lives aren't worth living is a problematic judgment. But it is true that it takes a great many resources to make their lives good, and in a neglectful society the lives can be terrible. And certainly in the history of Western society in the last few hundred years, there have been many cases of disabled people and mentally ill people whose lives have been miserable because of the way the society treats them. Our society is definitely far from perfect, and we don't live in a completely inclusive society. It may well be that ultimately our goal should be to have the most inclusive society possible, but that's not society as it is now. So given that that's the situation as it is now, it may be quite a reasonable decision for parents to decide they don't want to have a child with Down syndrome or with a severe mental illness. I think the point is, though, that we are still making these value judgments, and I think given the history of the eugenics in the 20th century, we need to be very careful about those value judgments. The idea, we might want to condemn the scientists of the past as simply being ignorant we might want to say, well, now we are much wiser than they were. But I think that's to take a position of an unjustified position, really. I mean, constantly we look back on the past and decide everybody else before us was stupid, and we're not stupid. But then it's quite likely that people in 100 years' time are going to look back on us and think those people were so ignorant, and they're going to think that they were much wiser than us. So I think it's really important for us to have a position of humility, and to realize that the judgments we make right now may well be judged to be wrong in the future. So we need to be very cautious in making our decisions about which lives are valuable and which ones are not. So the disability rights movement and the social model of disability is very important in indicating that the lives of people with mental illnesses and with disabilities can be very rich. So my conclusion then is that we need to kind of be very cautious when we're making these sorts of judgments. Certainly there was a lot of hatred in Nazi Germany and a lot of irrational emotion, but the history of eugenics as an international movement had a lot of scientists and leaders of society who considered themselves to be very well-meaning and wanted the best for society. And so now we look back on their views as deeply mistaken. But it was, a lot of those people were very sincere in their beliefs. So in inheriting the past and the history of eugenics, we need to kind of be very mindful of that past, and in making judgments we need to work very hard not to kind of repeat the mistakes that have been made before. That's my message.